You're listening to the Decidedly podcast with Sanger Smith and Sean Smith. Our mission is to help business owners like you defeat bad decision-making so you can improve your health, wealth, and relationships. We do this by digging deep into the stories and expertise of our guests and distilling their knowledge into actionable wisdom for you to carry into your life and business. If you're new to the show, welcome. Be sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. If you prefer to watch this week's episode, head on over to YouTube for the full video. Now, let's get into this week's episode and defeat bad decision-making in your life and business.
So don't take this as an apology for me because I don't really do that.
Yeah, you're not fond of those.
No, but the sort of praise, I guess. Right? How about that?
You don't do that a lot either.
Well, so here it goes. I used to think that you were not really skillful at dating.
Oh, really?
Because you would cut and run so quick.
Oh yeah, I would bail early.
You would, and so I thought it was a problem. But I think what it was is you were due congratulations, because I think what was happening, and you told me this at the time, you said, yeah, I asked her this question, or we had this discussion and we decided, that was it. And I never did it that way. Like when I was dating, I didn't want to ask anything that might rock the boat.
Yeah.
I don't want to scare this person off. I was just so thankful somebody wanted to date me. I wasn't going to ask.
Happy to be there.
I'm just happy to be there. I'm not going to certainly raise up, some thorny issue that may cause them.
I'd do it early.
I know.
I'd go. So what are your thoughts on abortion and taxes?
Yeah, right out of the gate. I was like, no. And, off they'd go.
You got to figure that out.
No, so you were, all right.
Not going to be reconciled 3 years in.
Well, no, you don't want to find those things out later, right?
You might as well talk about it. I mean, yeah, I did do that. And I remember there would be big things where, I remember one specifically where I was like, you go, are you still dating so-and-so? I was like, nope. Do you know why? I said,
yeah, that's what always wins.
I was like, she believes in subjective morality. And you were like, well, I mean, that's just her opinion. And I was like, that's horrible. I said, Dad, she said Hitler was right in his own mind. That's not good.
Yeah, I think we ended up having about a 45-minute discussion about that.
I can't date someone who's that, that way. But but I think my relationship with Megan is probably my longest. And that's how it should be.
That's how it should.
So speaking of love and relationships, our guest today talks a lot about love and relationships and also how it relates to what we talk most about, which is money. So Abby Davisson is a Fortune 200 leader turned author. She's the author of a fantastic book called Money and Love. Talks all about how the decisions that we make need to be considering both love and money. They're never in one camp or the other. A lot of times we think about big decisions. Oh, can I afford to buy this new house? We don't think about the relational components of that decision. Or we think about getting married, dating. We don't think about the financial impacts of those decisions. So we talked a lot about different decisions in our life, how we can intersect money and love when making those decisions. Abby shared with us her 5C process for how to make better decisions. So whether you're making decisions based on love or money or everything in between, follow her 5Cs and you're going to be much better off. So I learned a lot. I had a lot of great takeaways from today. Stick around. You'll learn a lot too. My name's Sanger Smith. I'm with my dad, Sean Smith, and this is Decidedly. So many of our clients who we work with deal with non-money decisions that end up having a money impact. And until I learned about the work that you do, I don't think that I could have put the integration of love and money as like a key problem that people are dealing with. But then I hear about Abby and I'm like, this is exactly what people are struggling with that I see all the time.
So when you look at decision making, aside from the inconsequential decisions, the sort of Coke or Pepsi decisions, are you finding that most decisions drop into these two buckets of love and money, or are there other things you just decided not to address in the book?
Well, Freud said that love and work are the two fundamental aspects of humanity. And so those are the ones that we address. And to your point, it's not the inconsequential decisions, but it's often those hard decisions that have multiple correct answers, depending on what your priorities are, that are hard precisely because they touch on elements of relationships, elements of love, and elements of finances, elements of career. And our conventional wisdom is that we should really separate those two decisions, right? Keep them, make career decisions, make financial decisions with your head, really analyze them, don't get emotional. But when it comes to relationships, follow your heart. Don't actually bring money into the equation because that's materialistic. And the truth is that every big decision that you make in life, and most of them that we think of as hard decisions, have an element of money and an element of love in them. And so if you silo them, if you separate them, you're not thinking holistically, and you're more likely to make a decision that you regret.
That is so true. And I learned that I started doing this work about 35 years ago as a financial advisor, and found that I was approaching, because I thought that was the answer, to approach everything mathematically. In other words, I can tell you the right answer, whether you ought to pay off this mortgage, you ought to retire, or one spouse ought to stay home and work, stay with the kids rather than become employed. And I found very quickly that it was rarely the case that these were logical or mathematical answers. The question of sort of paying off the house is
but you
much
find that out because people don't take your mathematical advice.
Well, they would try and argue with the clear mathematical answer.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah. And so it became pretty obvious early on that many of the decisions, just as you're saying, have this overlap of a sort of an emotional component and a factual component. And I found that very, very early on. Do you find that there are different types of people that just sort of gravitate towards one methodology of decision making than the other?
Yes. And there is a quiz on our book website, which is moneylovebook.com, that gets at exactly this question. What is your tendency when it comes to making decisions? And there are people who, to the way that you started off, are very analytical, and they like the mathematical inputs. They like all the tabs on their spreadsheets. They want to gather all the data. And then there are people who are more focused on what their gut tells them. And the data is a helpful input, but they're not like making spreadsheets. They're going to sort of follow their gut or their emotions. And then there are some people who are in between. And so it's very helpful to know what your tendency is, because, by the way, when many of us have to make big decisions, or when we're stressed, we tend to kind of be more extreme in our tendencies. And so once you're familiar with what your tendency is, you can put some guardrails up to counteract that tendency, give you a chance to, for example, trick yourself to move past the tendency. And I'll give you an example. I mean, I tend towards an analyzer type. I like to have, all the data. I was a consultant for my first job, professionally. And the challenge with those of us who are analyzer types is that we can get into analysis paralysis, and you can sort of start to put off making the decision as you're gathering all the information, which, by the way, we never have as much information as we want in life. We don't have a crystal ball. We can't predict, even with the mathematical equations, exactly what's going to happen. And so, I have found over time that I now give myself a time limit for decisions. I do certain things that help me overcome that tendency towards gathering all the data. And you can do the opposite if you tend towards being a gut truster. You can actually make yourself wait longer to make a decision if you tend to be the ready, fire, aim type.
Yeah, I've seen that with couples making decisions that they will go in to buy a car and say, we've decided we're not going to make a decision today. Like, we're not going to get pressured into buying this house, buying this car, buying this RV.
Yeah, but you gotta know when you're going to make that decision.
No, that's exactly right.
That's such a bad trap to fall into, where people are like, well, I'm not deciding right now. Okay, fine. When are you going to decide? And then sometimes people, I'm not going to decide right now, but they don't decide when they're going to decide, or they don't decide what information they would need in order to be able to decide. So they go back to that tendency of research, and they never end up deciding. And that's the worst outcome. You can buy the car, you can not buy the car. Not deciding is not a real
Well, the not deciding is a decision, right?
Exactly. Yes. And I think many people don't realize that putting off the decision is in itself a decision, and there might be opportunity costs to that missed window, or, especially with couples too, if you're not on the same page about how you're going to make the decision. And that's, I think why this material was so helpful to me when I first encountered it. It's my co-author is a professor who taught a course that inspired the book for almost 50 years at Stanford Business School. And I took her course as a second-year MBA student who had met someone in business school. We were trying to make big life decisions together about accepting jobs in the same city, if we were going to live together, if we ended up in the same city. And having a framework, or having a shared vocabulary, having a comfort level with talking about some of these challenging topics, which were daunting, especially early on in a relationship, was so helpful to us, because getting on the same page is so critical.
Yeah. So when you look at these two types of decision makers, the sort of more analytical or more emotional based, and you talked about putting guardrails in, you gave one example of establishing a time frame, sort of scooting it out for the more emotional folks, bringing it in for the more analytical folks. Are there other guardrails that are handy in that, in sort of protecting yourself against the extremes?
Yeah. I mean, the backbone of our book is this framework, a approach to making decisions that ensures that you're really turning over the right rocks, that the research says are the critical ways to prevent against the cognitive biases that we all have as humans. And so we call our framework the 5 C's, and each of the C's actually gets at one of the critical elements that if you skip, you will, be likely to not have the ideal conditions for your decision. It's not a silver bullet. We're not saying you follow this and you'll never make a bad decision, because it's really about ensuring the process has integrity. The outcome you have less control over. But if you followed our framework, we believe that you are doing everything that the research says you should be doing to make a decision that you feel good about and that aligns with your values.
So let's talk about that framework a little bit. So when we look at the 5 C's, I guess the first one is to clarify what the decision is, right?
And clarify what's most important to you. So yes, the clarifying the decision is important too, but then what do you care about in that decision?
That is an interesting one to start with, because what I find is that a lot of people understand that they should do that, but they wrestle between understanding what they want. In other words, I want to clarify what I want, but it gets overpowered with maybe wanting what I want. In other words, not knowing what I want that I want. You know what I mean? Like,
I do.
I think I should want this, but I really want that.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
It does. And it's so true that we are all so influenced by what our parents, other important figures to us, think that we should want. Mimetic desire, this term that French philosopher René Girard coined to say that we want what other people want. And so a lot of the work of clarifying is tuning out all those other voices and tuning in to what you specifically care about. And you can do that in a number of ways. Core values is something that I have found very helpful in my life. And often when something seems off, it's because I'm not in alignment with my core values. And there are lots of ways to identify core values, but that can be a helpful North Star in getting at, okay, I'm not going to think about what my grandmother wanted for me. Like, that's not really what I'm answering here. I need to think about what matters to me and what will make this the right decision for me.
Yeah, a lot of times I see people who make decisions that they're convicted in, and then they get their confidence gets attacked because their parents are not on board or their friends are not on board, or they share this decision with other people who go, what the heck? Why would you do that? A friend of mine just moved to New York City. He is about my age, and he's like, you know what? If I never really give it a shot at becoming a stand-up comic, I'm going to regret it for my whole life. So I got to go do it. And I was like, dude, that's the coolest thing ever. Like, I'm so happy for you. He works from home. So he's moving to New York. It's not like he's just completely giving up everything he's got, but he's selling everything he has, moves to New York, still got an income source. Now, I think in the grand scheme of life risks, that's not that crazy, right? You're not going to be homeless and broke, right? You're going to be living, you're going to have a place to live, you have a job, you're going to pursue this career. His dad is an immigrant, had to come over here, learn the language, grind, values security over everything. And it's like, oh my gosh, son, you have made a mistake. What are you doing? And then all of a sudden I could see on him, he's like, oh man, I don't know.
Yeah.
Go for it, man. You know, but it's based on your own value set. And every decision that we make is based on a value set. It might as well be the one that we agree with.
Absolutely. And you can tell your friend that the research backs him up, because what we tend to regret when you look at, there's a study that was done, the American Regret Survey that Dan Pink did, and he cataloged, thousands and thousands of regrets. And the ones that came up the most frequently were regrets of inaction. So the risk you didn't take, the opportunity you could have pursued that you didn't because you were playing it safe, for example. And so that is, a very common regret. And he's right that those are the types of regrets that plague people, decades and decades later. And it sounds like he's relatively early on in his life and career, and, he can recover. If it doesn't work out, at least he will know that he tried. And like you said, he has the security of an income while he's trying.
And I've met lots of people who start a business that didn't quite succeed in the way that they had hoped and dreamed it would. And none of those people that I've met yet have said, man, I really should not have started this business. They might say, it didn't quite work out. If I knew everything I knew, I'm not sure that I would do it. Like, if I knew it was going to go this way, I'm not sure if I would have done it at the time. But none of them ever say, oh, I should have kept that 9 to 5.
Or, at the very least, you're getting some experience, which is what you get when you don't get what you really want.
Yeah. And you can't know, like, that book, by the way, Daniel Pink's book is amazing.
Yeah. Sanger and I met him in DC.
Yeah. A few years 3 or 4 years ago.
Power of Regret, I think is really good. So clarify is the first C. What's the second?
So the second is communicate with the other person or people who are going to be most affected by the decision. And, to your point, I mean, when your friend talked to his father, he had a very strong opinion about what was important to him. But, I would say, yes, your parents are important, but who we're really talking about is if you are, in a relationship, if there's someone else in your household who's going to be affected by a move or a new job or, any of the number of decisions we're talking about here at the intersection of money and love, those are the people to share your point of view with, share the decision before you have thought it all through. Because I think our tendency, again, is to, clarify, understand exactly what we want to do, and then bring someone in when we feel most comfortable. But the problem is, if you wait too long, then those people feel like they don't have input. And if they're truly, have a stake in this decision, they need to have input early on. It's not to say that you need to then change your mind based on their input, but we say that clarify and communicate are a bit of a dance, almost like DNA strands. You might clarify yourself, communicate with the person who's most affected by the decision. That might cause you to re-clarify, and so on. And so you start the communication process early, because these are tough conversations, and they it is a muscle, as I'm sure you've seen with your clients. The more you have them, the easier it is over time. But the key thing is to start.
It can be a bit circular, I guess, in a positive way, because you're refining and improving both the clarification and the communication.
Is there a wrong way to communicate?
Absolutely. Well,
other than not doing it.
Yeah. I mean, listen, we often think about what we want to say when we communicate, but it's very important to think about when and how we communicate. So a wrong way to communicate is to blurt something out, off the cuff as you're brushing your teeth, getting ready for bed at night, right? And you say, I've been thinking and I really want to quit my job. It's just my new boss is terrible and I hate it. And
then you leave.
Yeah, you're like, and now you're supposed to go to bed. Like, how's that going to work, right? So, or like as you're, if you have young kids, right, as you're getting them out the house in the morning, to say, oh, remind me tonight, I really want to talk about the fact that we are going to move, right? It's like, no, like don't leave someone. So that kind of communication is not helpful. I think finding the right time, making an appointment, frankly, like just as you would with someone you work with for the topic, if it's going to be a heavy one, is important. And then also creating the conditions for success. So, giving the person a heads up, really stopping to listen to what they say, as opposed to just formulate your next response as they're sharing their perspective. Those are ways that that can prevent the form of communication where nobody feels good after the conversation.
You ever done that on a big decision, Dad? I communicate right.
Yeah, all the time. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, I communicated a big decision one time where I bought an ultralight airplane, but I communicated it after the fact.
Yeah.
And that
to mom?
Yeah, it did not go well.
I'm shocked to hear that.
Why? Why was she not on board with this aviation
I was
kit?
really shocked by her surprise that I had bought this.
I'm guessing never even expressed any interest in it as a hobby.
No, because had I, she would have quashed it early on. So
that's so good.
Yeah, I can admit that was a mistake.
That's a good one.
If you are not in a relationship where you need to bring another person in, where it's a co-decision, like let's move, or we're gonna have kids, or job change, something like that. I'm guessing it's helpful to bring in other people who have expertise or have been where you're trying to go, and maybe talk through the decision to get valuable input, I guess.
So you're anticipating the fourth C, which is to check in. So the third and fourth C's go together. The third C is to broaden your set of choices. And so when we are in a big decision, we tend to see the extremes. We see should I marry this person or break up with them? Should I go for the promotion or should I quit this job and find another one? And the truth is there are so many different elements along that spectrum, different choices that might not be apparent to you. And by broadening your set of choices, you increase your likelihood of making a better choice when you're not just in those binary extremes.
So how do you do that? Because that seems like
it is an example.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you illustrate an example of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we were in, everything was shut down in COVID, my family, my husband and I were working remotely from rooms that were not intended to be offices. We have 2 young kids. They were Zooming in to Zoom kindergarten and second grade. In our dining room, we had this rotating cast of college students trying to help them stay on task while we did our jobs. So we were all on top of each other all the time in our home, which, is in the middle of San Francisco. It's not very big. And so we thought, wow, we really need to move. We could stay in this house, but we will drive ourselves crazy, or we could find more space. And the only way we thought about finding more space was by renovating or by moving. And when we started to explore, and one of the fourth C is about checking in. So we talked to people who had made the move from San Francisco to a nearby suburb that has more space. One of the people I checked in with was a friend who actually showed me that she rented an office near her home, like a short walk away. And there, she also had young kids, but she's a writer and a coach. And she said, oh yeah, I could never do this work in my home. But, she didn't want to do it in a co-working space. So she found an office nearby. And that started my wheels turning to say, oh, okay, there is a way to do this. And I actually am talking to you from an office that I rented, which, we ended up avoiding the very expensive decision of moving or renovating our home, and found the extra space we needed in a more creative way than I originally had identified when I thought about it in that throes of, this is so stressful, we're all on top of each other.
Yeah. That's such a good point that I don't think I've thought of consciously, but I kind of do that with clients going through big decisions where a lot of times I'll notice they're like, oh, should I do this? Should I take this action? I go, well, you could do all these other things, and I'll list out all of the sometimes even ridiculously stupid decisions that they could do to solve this problem. They'll be like, well, how should I pay for this debt that I have or whatever? Well, okay, so let's start. You could sell your house. All right, we're definitely not doing that one, right? And then just to get them to understand that it's not just this either or thing. Do I pay it from this account or that account? It's like, well, you got a lot of different ways. Some of them are bad. And then we're going to get to the ones you talk about. And then we're going to get to like creative solutions even after that.
And you are so helpful in that because you are, a neutral third party, right? You're not invested in the decision in the same way as if you lived in that house that was going to be sold.
Yeah.
You have expertise, you have pattern recognition from working with other clients. You're able to generate more creative solutions that are informed by your experience. And they're, so I think you're, an example, checking in with a financial advisor is absolutely one of those experts that it's helpful to check in with in that check-in step.
Yeah, that's helpful.
That happened with the wedding planning. My
really?
fiance was like, well, how are we going to find a venue for 300 people or whatever it was? And I was like, well, the only thing we have to do is get married. So there's a lot of ways to do that, right? We could just go to the courthouse. We could do it with just our parents. We could like run through all the options. And she needed them, but I needed them too, to go, what does this option look like? What does a family only wedding look like? What does a destination look like? Instead of just assuming we had to do it this way, that was our gut instinct. Ultimately, we did do a big wedding anyway, but the point was it helped her feel confident in it. Like, yeah, I chose this. I'm also not going to halfway through it go, why did I do this big wedding? Why did I invite my third cousin? Like, no, we did it on purpose for a reason, and we know what those reasons are.
I just had this conversation last week with your sister. So she was working remotely up in Anchorage. And so we were talking about, do you have a car that you would keep up there in long-term storage, or do you not have a car? And she goes, well, I did a kind of a third option. She had a car that she rented out under Turo or whatever that rideshare app.
Yeah.
So she goes, I was making money from the car. So it wasn't a decision of have a car up there and, waste the money or not have a car. She had this third option that she had a rental car that she was making money from. I'm like, I didn't even think of it.
Wouldn't have thought of that.
No, I wouldn't have thought of that. So coming up with those third choices or expanding it from a binary choice, I think often is a really helpful exercise. And doing what you're doing, Sanger, about talking with, here's a crazy approach you could do, or here's an opposite thing you could do, or here's a thing we're definitely not doing.
Yeah, what's the worst option?
Yeah, it expands your thoughts about it.
Absolutely.
So what is the next C?
So the fifth C, the last C, is to consider the consequences. And that's both the short-term consequences, which is where most of us go, right? Because we have a short-term bias, but also playing out the consequences over the medium and the long term, where we don't necessarily go immediately when we think about the consequences. And so you're really asking someone to predict, to forecast to the best of their knowledge, what's both the best thing that could happen in the short, medium, and long term, and the worst thing that could happen, to your point about brainstorming, all the possible things, and then give them a likelihood, right? You're forecasting a likelihood of happening, and you're really trying to trick your brain to overcome that bias of only seeing, the worst thing that could happen in the short term and immediately saying, oh, well, I don't want to do that. And so, I'll give you another example. We, as part of this decision to stay in our current home, we also decided to switch where my kids went to school. And my older son was going into 4th grade and he was going to be switching schools. And he was like, "You're ruining my life, Mom. Like, I'm not going to know anybody here. This is totally going to disrupt, everything." And I said, "I get that. It feels that way, right? In the short term, it's disruptive. It's unfamiliar. You're going to have to meet all new people. But here's the thing. This new school goes up to 8th grade and your old school only goes up to 5th grade. So you're actually going to be able to stay in this school longer, and you'll have, the benefits of being there for several more years and having less disruption over the long term." And so, he was only 9 at the time. I don't know that I really made such a stirring argument to him. But
May or may not have worked. Yeah,
exactly. But you know what? Actually, now he loves it. And, we are relieved that we don't need to make, yet another school decision since he is going to 6th grade next year. And so I think sometimes we just overlook some of the longer term positive consequences. And by playing out different time horizons, we force ourselves to see those more clearly.
Yeah, that is really smart, because I think so often we overvalue the short-term consequences, and underweight those long-term consequences, whether that's saving money now or retirement or whatever it is, but we tend to really value the short term.
Oh, people do that with like taxes. Well, I got to get my tax bill lower this year. Maybe that's the right move. Or we could think about your lifetime tax bill and focus on doing that one. Sometimes the answer is I'd rather pay more today so I can pay less later.
Yeah,
but
that's a good one.
It's hard to arrive at that conclusion in a bubble. It's hard for me to think long term when I'm not checking in.
Well, and that's why the framework is iterative, right? It's not like, okay, I check off these 5 steps and then like I'm done. It's that, you go through the steps and then you go back and you say, is this still, is what I clarified that I want still what I want, or has something changed based on the information that I've gotten that actually makes me want to re-clarify? And that, in the example I shared of the moving versus renovating, we thought we wanted to move because we needed a bigger space and we needed schools that were going to be open, because at the time, San Francisco was the largest urban school district that was remote the longest during COVID. And we were able to get both of those things because we re-clarified, actually, it's not moving. We realized my husband and I both had entrepreneurial aspirations. And if we moved to a bigger house and locked in a larger mortgage that was going to constrain us to the jobs that we were in, we would not be able, we'd have to push off those entrepreneurial dreams. And so we re-clarified that what mattered more to us than extra space and schools was career flexibility. So we decided to stay, but we were still able to get those things we wanted, just in a different way.
I think sometimes we have a tendency to, especially without going through this process, to arrive at what seems to be the most logical solution. And then my problem is no longer really present. My problem is just, how do I implement this solution? So it's like, we need more space. How do we get more space? We move. Okay, how do I move? And now I'm focused on how to make the move happen and where to move. I got to realize, is it really that, what's that most important thing? Is the most important thing isn't moving for y'all. The most important thing was the space. Okay, well, can I solve this in another way? And then you get to be able to see that there's more options. But so often I see people stop at whatever that first solution was, and then they want to figure out, how do I get that solution implemented? And a lot of times I'll ask people, what's important about moving? What's important about this solution? And it's like they've forgotten what the original, they've almost forgotten
what we're trying to solve
the original
for,
motivation was. Yeah.
Which of these steps do people have the most difficulty with?
Well, what's the most important step, which I think is what trips people up often, is the clarify step, right? And to your point, sometimes people think they know what they want and they jump immediately into execution or problem solving for that. And so because of all the external influences on our wants and all the ways that we are conditioned, to put aside what we really want, or to, sort of just accept what society tells us we should want, it takes us a lot longer, and many of us a very long time, to get quiet enough to really distill that. And so I think that is the most critical step. that people tend to skip over or just work on superficially. And by the way, if you are able to clarify really distinctly, it helps all the other steps fall into place in a different way. So I think that is what I would say is the most critical one. The second most difficult step is the communicate step, because it is so hard to share your deepest desires, with yourself, but then also with, people who are important to you, because it involves being vulnerable. And we don't like to be vulnerable. We're evolutionarily conditioned not to be vulnerable.
Right.
My mom's catchphrase is, it's called communication.
Oh, I get it.
It's called communication.
I fail at it so often.
and it's funny because it's only said when zero communication has been
when she's pointing out your lack of it.
Yeah, it's not because it's we gave it our best bet and didn't succeed. It's like, you literally did not even tell me you were going to buy that stupid
No, she
plan.
never says it when when she's highlighting how good a job I've done.
No.
Yeah.
So the intersection of love and money. We talked earlier, there's decisions that seem like they're all about love, decisions that seem like they're all about money, but we really ought to consider both. What are the decisions that most people think are totally about love that need to also be considering money, or vice versa?
Well, the chapters of our book are organized according to all the decisions that you tend to face in life. I mean, they're not always chronological, but, starting with, is this the person I want to spend the rest of my life with? Who you want to do that with seems like it's a love decision, but there are so many ways where our partner influences our choice of careers, our, so many financial decisions are affected by that choice, all the way up through, deciding to combine careers and children, sharing household chores, through where and when to move, through deciding to get divorced, and elder care, right? And so all of those decisions that we face in life might seem on the surface to be about one thing, right? Okay, I want to get married. Well, who do I love, right? Who is really making me feel, passionate and like I really, want to spend the rest of my life with them? It's great for the love and the passion to be there, and obviously it needs to be, but having the conversations very early on with that person to bring in the financial aspect, to talk about, for example, before you go on vacation with someone, start talking about budgeting, start saying, hey, I'd love to talk about what we're going to spend on this trip because I'm still paying off my educational debt. And it's really important to me that I, make these loan payments. I'd love to know, if you have financial priorities, what do those look like, right? So bringing it up in an organic, natural way, so it doesn't seem so forced and awkward. It's still going to be awkward, right? We're not comfortable talking about this stuff. There's no like Netflix series that shows the couple falling in love and revealing educational debt to each other. But I think there should be.
Yeah.
But finding those ways. So that's an example, and finding those ways to bring in the financial aspect early on is so important.
Yeah, the earlier the better, right? There kind of actually is a Netflix show that does this.
Yeah.
Have y'all ever seen Love is Blind?
Oh, yes.
Oh, no, I need to put it on my list.
Okay. I mean, it's not good.
No?
it's not good. Here's the concept, Abby, is they lock people in these rooms. They can't see each other, and they like, quote unquote, date a bunch of different people. And so it's just basically phone calls. You, the audience, can see both people, right? And then by the end of the period, they've picked their person and they're going to propose to them, even though they've never seen them. And then the rest of the show is, now this is your fiance who you got engaged to before you
trying to undo that decision.
Yeah. And then it's them basically realizing how much of a mistake they made. But it's not usually because they got to the point where they saw the person physically and went, oh, dang, she's not that cute. It's usually not that ruins it. It's that there's all these other things, one of which is money, that they don't talk about when it's just the lovey-dovey stage. And then so they go, they move in together and they realize, oh, he's broke. This is not going to work.
And he's going to stay broke,
more
than likely. Yeah.
And so doing it early, it's hard to undo that love decision when it's been all love the whole time. But if you bring money in early, yeah, I mean, it's like it can solve for a big problem. Sean used to always tell me, like, one of the big differences between entrepreneurs who are successful or advisors who are successful and those who aren't is how supportive their spouse is. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I've seen that people who, if rightly or wrongly, if your spouse is saying, hey, I need you home at 5 every day on the dot, well, it's going to be tough for you to succeed in an entrepreneurial career.
Yeah, for better or worse, they make a big impact on career. And so it's interesting point that you're making about, how we think about the person that we want to spend the rest of our life with. It seems like a love decision, but that has an inordinate amount of impact on your career success or lack thereof, is how they're supporting or not supporting what you're doing.
Yeah. And my co-author, who taught this class for many years, often would get emails after the course saying, I decided based on your course to break up with the person that I was dating, or even I broke off of an engagement. And they would, she would write back. And we actually just got an email from we now give workshops at companies and other places. And we did a workshop at a reunion at Stanford's reunion. And someone emailed us and said, after I took your workshop, I decided I was dating the wrong person for me. And we broke it off and I took some time to heal. And, I'm so appreciative because now I've met someone new. He actually said, we're going through the exercises in your book together. And I feel so much more confident that this is the right person for me because we've had these conversations early on. And, it's hard to realize that, but so much better that you realize that early on in a relationship as opposed to once you have, a couple of kids and your lives are more entangled.
Yeah. So the message there is don't send your spouse to one of Abby's workshops alone.
Not by herself.
Yeah. Don't send her by herself for sure. When you look at a decision like that, which we've talked about, seems like a love decision around compatibility and who you're going to spend your life with, but is really a bigger decision around love and money. What are the key things that where do you start? Like in that discussion, you don't want to start too big too soon. You don't want to seem over eager or, awkward so you kind of wade into these discussions. What do you start with typically?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to share some of the long-term goals that you have early on. It doesn't need to be like, okay, well, I'm going to share my long-term goals and see if you're on board. But you could say like, I've always dreamed of writing a book, for example. That was one of my long-term goals. And, my mother was a librarian. Books were really sacred in our house. And so just, making sure that as you're getting to know someone, you're sharing some of those long-term dreams with them so that it's not out of left field when you then start to get a little bit more serious and you say, okay, well, my husband and I, we met when we were taking this course. And so we had to do our homework, right? We had to have these conversations as part of the final paper we were writing. And it gave us permission in a way to broach some of the topics that would have been more awkward. So I always say, get our book and then blame the book. Say, oh, I heard this author, on Decidedly. And I realized like, we haven't talked about what we want to do long term. We haven't talked about how are we going to, spend time with our families? Are we going to end up moving closer to one of them when we have kids, right? These are the types of discussions that it's so much better to have when it's abstract, right? When it's just this theoretical thing, as opposed to, okay, now we have a baby and my parents are saying they'll watch our baby if we move closer to them. Like that's actually the worst time to make the decision because you're sleep deprived, you're desperate for childcare, you're like going to be willing to do anything. But have you really thought that through in a calm time? And, our book really advocates against making decisions in the heat of the moment, right? In a split moment. And so the more you can bring those up, and our book has exercises, that you can use and do together to make it be less forced.
What about the opposite? What are the decisions that seem most logical that people need to, and they seem most money focused, people need to bring love into?
Yeah. I mean, I think you probably get questions all the time about retirement, about, how do I, when can I retire? And often people think of it as, a number that they need to hit. I mean, obviously the FIRE movement has made that very, specific, and there's all these formulas you can use. But really, work, yes, it's a source of income, but it's also a source of meaning and purpose and a way for you to have impact in a way that matters to you. And so often I think people think of it only as a financial decision, like when have I earned enough so that I could, retire, but haven't thought through, well, how am I going to remain engaged? How am I going to continue to find purpose and meaning and fulfillment in my life once I am not compelled to work for money? And I've had the good fortune of collaborating with my co-author, who is, 4 decades older than I am, and watching how she has navigated this decision. She's quote unquote retired several times over the years. She keeps saying it doesn't stick because, she will take it, make the decision financially. Yes, I can retire, but then, misses teaching. And so she'll go back to teaching, or, ended up writing, a memoir, and then the book that we wrote together, and then going to promote those. And that involves speaking and workshops. And so, it's not at all just a financial decision, but I think we're so conditioned to think of it as one that we don't bring in the, well, how will I get to do the things that I am good at and care about?
It comes in so often, the emotional side of it. I had a conversation this week with somebody who was wrestling with this retirement issue, and they were about to sell their business for 100 times their annual expenses. Right.
Okay. So they're good.
That you and I instantly would know they're good. Here was the question: is that going to be enough for me? That's what they were asking, and they were genuinely nervous about, was it going to be adequate? And you and I know that it's going to be adequate. They've just got 100 times whatever their annual expenses are. But you're bringing in the good point that there's more. I think that there was more of a concern about, what am I going to do? Where will I find purpose? What will I do with my time? Than really the financial. That's really where the discussion ended up going. What do you find is there are these big decisions, life decisions with who am I going to marry? What job am I going to take? Am I going to sell my business? Am I going to retire? What are you finding is the decision that people struggle with the most? It's the hardest one to wrestle with.
Well, as we were researching the book, we did a survey that we sent to, thousands of people. And the decision that they brought up the most, it was about moving, where to live and when to move. And that's a decision that we make over and over. Many of these decisions, we hope we only make once or a small number of times, right, about who to marry. But moving comes up frequently. It affects everything in our lives in terms of who we see every day, how much we're spending on our residence, lots of different factors. And in the last several years, there have been dramatic changes to where people can work, how they do their work. And so it's really thrown all these questions, up in the air again for so many people, saying, well, if I can work anywhere, why am I still paying, such high taxes? Or, if I can work anywhere, do I, really want to live so far from my family? And so this idea of where to live and when to move is an evergreen topic that touches on so many aspects of our life's fulfillment and satisfaction.
Yeah, it never goes away. I mean, that's a near end of life decision too. Are we going to put mom in a home, or is it time to sell the house and go into assisted living or something like that? It's a decision that hits you throughout your life.
Yeah, I've had a lot of clients who are going to they are considering putting a spouse or parent in assisted living, and they totally can't afford it. But they don't want to do it. But they know they should do it, but then they don't do it. And they ask me 100 times, can I afford it? And I say 100 times, you can afford it. And they still don't do it. And then other people, if they've made a plan ahead of time, hey, when we get to this point, this is what we're going to do. They've kind of pre-decided. It's still difficult, but they waffle less about whether they should do it.
Yeah.
And that one is like a great example of that's money and love, because the people that can afford it but don't do it, they're not really worried about, oh, Sanger's probably not good at math and he says we can afford it, but we can't. But they've got, 1% of it might be a financial insecurity or uncertainty, and 99 might be intrapersonal. I mean, am I doing the right thing?
Right. And have I actually talked to, if you're able to have the conversation, with your, the aging relative that you're considering, what is their perspective and how have we kind of worked through that? And I went through that with my own parents. My mom had an accident and needed a lot of care. And first, my dad was managing that with home health aides, but then it became very clear that that was not sustainable. And so I had a conversation with him about, have you thought about life plan communities, right? Continuing care, retirement communities. And he said, yeah, I don't think we can afford that. And I, sort of said, well, can we just go on some tours? Let's just together go look at some options and then we'll cross the bridge of affordability. And so, we did. And then he found one that, accepted insurance, and it ended up being, the right thing for them. But it was not until I really pushed him on it that he said, okay, let's consider it. And I think it was because he felt, guilty about doing that. And he said he would, care for my mom in sickness and in health. And so this was a decision that someone else was going to be, providing that care, and they wouldn't share, a home. They'd be under, he ended up in the independent living arm and she ended up in the skilled nursing arm. And so, they were in the same place, which was helpful during COVID, but there were so many more elements under there. But his immediate response was, well, we can't afford it. So I think that's very true for so many people.
What surprised you during this research that you did about decision making?
Just how many people feel alone when they're in the throes of a big decision. And, I mentioned the survey that we did. We could see on our end, because we had all the responses, how many people brought up moving, for example, or how many people were struggling with, I want to spend more time with my family, but I don't see how I can make that work financially. But they all felt so alone when they were making the decision. It said, there's no one I could talk to about this, or there's, I'm the only one going through something like this. And so there is this element of, everyone is going through something like this at any given time together. But we feel so much shame about not having figured it out. And, why is this taking me so long? Why is this, plaguing me so much? That we don't share and we don't talk to people about it. And so one of the reasons we wrote our book was to give people the comfort of knowing there's lots of data in there, but there's lots of stories too. The comfort of knowing that they're not alone, that there are other people struggling with these decisions, and there's a way to make them easier.
What was your favorite story that you put in the book?
There's so many. I mean, I love the process of getting to collaborate with my co-author, and she, we have both of our stories in the book. So I love the story that she tells about, so she ended up getting divorced from her first husband, and her, the second man she married, who actually was friends with her first husband, and she knew him, he was actually in their wedding. He suggested early on that they have Thanksgiving together. He said, listen, your kids won't have to, go to two different places for Thanksgiving. Let's invite, his family over too. And she said, absolutely not. But, ask me again in 5 years. And so, he was patient. He asked her again. And she said, okay, I'll give it a shot. But if they don't behave, they're not getting invited back.
They're out of here.
So they did do Thanksgiving together. And it worked so well for everyone that they continued that tradition until her second husband and then her first husband passed away, but her kids never had to choose who they would spend Thanksgiving with. And I think that, she tells that story in the divorce chapter to talk about what was important to her in that, in the experience of getting divorced was not having her children need to take sides. And so a lot of the decisions that they made about how to divorce and about how to proceed after the divorce were to center her kids and to continue to have a positive relationship with with them and that they felt, that they had a positive relationship with both of their parents. And that just shows, I think, first of all, how gracious, her second husband and her, she was, but also just how this tool of clarifying what's important to you can have a real impact on all the other decisions you make.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and it brings up another point about how do you deselect something you've already selected. You talked about divorce, and we've been spending time on that. But what final question, what would you say is your biggest decision-making tip for business owners and leaders?
So often people tend to slide into decisions, right? They are, choose the default option or the one that is going to be, the easiest. And, I mentioned that my husband and I took this class together. And what we really were researching is the data that people who tend to live with their partner before they get married have higher divorce rates. And we dug into that and understood, why. And it's really when people slide versus decide that things can go sideways. So my biggest piece of advice to business owners is don't slide, decide.
Oh, that's good.
That's great. Thanks for being here. Where can people connect with you and get a copy of the book?
So the book website is moneylovebook.com, and there are lots of great resources there, including the quiz I mentioned and places to buy the book. And then I'd love if people would connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm Abby Davisson, and you can connect with me there and sign up for my newsletter, which is Practically Deliberate. I publish every other week or so with insights on intentionality, decision-making, and well-being.
Perfect. Thanks, Abby.
Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
My takeaway from talking with Abby is really, looking at her process around the 5 C's, but the clarify step in that process I thought was the most important, is spending the time really figuring out what is it that you're wanting there, clarifying what is the decision. Or do you want to move just because you want to move, you want more space, or you want to be closer to family, or what is it that you're really wanting? And then asking maybe that question that you and I ask clients is what's important about that. When you narrow down on what it is that you think you want, figuring out why you want that becomes really important, and it helps clarify that.
Yeah, it's never about what's on the surface. My big takeaway is every decision has some component of love and money. Even decisions that seem like they've got nothing to do with money have something to do with money. They're going to affect your work. They're going to affect your lifestyle, your livelihood, or your dollars directly. Even things that seem like they're 100% about money, they're going to affect your lifestyle. They're going to affect your relationships positively or negatively. So finding the intersection of those and having a discussion at the intersection of those instead of in one or the other camp is important.
You just made a great decision to listen to this episode of Decidedly. Make another great decision by subscribing to the show and leaving us a 5-star review wherever you're listening. We appreciate the support. It helps business owners like you find our community and defeat bad decision-making in their own lives. For more decision-making insights, check us out at decidedlypodcast.com, on Instagram at decidedlypodcast, or grab a copy of Sanger and Sean's books from the links in the show notes. Finally, we'd like to thank Shelby Peterson of Transcend Media for editing and post-production of the show. Thanks for listening. I'm Morgan, your producer, and this is Decidedly.